Dodge Billingsley, who is a fellow at the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies, is also Director of Combat Films and Research and Senior Faculty Member at the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Civil Military Relations. Billingsley has been a longtime observer of many wars and contested regions and has spent considerable time with U.S. and foreign militaries worldwide, including Chechen insurgent forces, Turkish special forces, Republic of Korea Marines. He embedded with U.S. Marines for the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and embedded again with the U.S. Army's 4-6 Infantry for the closure of the Al-Assad Air Base and the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Al-Anbar province. In western Iraq in December 2011. After 9/11, Billingsley was one of the first to cover the war in Afghanistan and was present at both the Kuala Jangi Fortress uprising, which took the life of CIA agent Johnny Michael Spann, the first U.S. combat casualty in Afghanistan, and also the battle for Shah-e-Khat Valley, known as Operation Anaconda. He has produced a wide variety of media from his fieldwork, including 2 books, Operation Anaconda, America's First Conventional Battle in Afghanistan, recently published by Kansas University Press, and Fangs of the Lone Wolf, Chechen Tactics in the Russian-Chechen Wars 1994 to 2009, recently published by the U.S. Army's Foreign Military Studies Office. In addition, Billingsley has produced and directed many documentary films and won the prestigious Rory Peck and Royal Television Society Award for Best Feature for the film House of War, and directed 9 films for the Kennedy Center under the series title Beyond the Border. These films include Helen Foster Snow, Witness to Revolution, Masses to Masses, An Artist in Mao's China, Chechnya, Separatism or Jihad, and Global Car. His current film in the series, Unfortunate Brothers, Korea's Reunification Dilemma, examines the prospects of Korea's reunification through the experience of a North Korean defector living in Seoul. Billingsley is an avid collector of realism art and serves on the advisory board at Utah Valley University's Woodbury Art Museum, where currently an exhibit of his Soviet military and industrial art is showing. He's curated numerous exhibits of Chinese revolutionary and Soviet social realism art at various museums in the western U.S., and is currently developing an exhibit of art produced by the Vietnamese during the war with the United States. He's lectured extensively at various universities and institutions, including this one, and is a regular contributor to Jane's Defense Weekly and Jane's Intelligence Review. Billingsley received a BA in History from Columbia University and an MA in War Studies from King's College London. We're always pleased and honored to welcome back to the Kennedy Center our good friend Dodge Billingsley, who today is speaking on Korea Divided, Perpetuating or Breaking the Cycle of Conflict. Please welcome Dodge Billingsley.
Well, thank you for showing up today. Was there anybody here last semester when I gave my lecture last semester? So you were 2. Okay, good. So, because I'm going to do, there's a little bit of repetition. As you know, we showed a shorter version of the film that was broadcast on HDNet World Report last year. But we've had a chance to then now go back and recut the film to what we consider the full length, and so we're looking forward to that. But I must say, it's always good to be back at the Kennedy Center. I was in Sembach, Germany last week with the 18th Military Police Brigade, who is going to be the final, unless things change, U.S. unit overseeing the U.S. Detention Center. They might overrun it as well, in Bagram. And everywhere I go, I'm not kidding, I always run into somebody that either attended BYU or has a connection to the Kennedy Center. It's really strange. We were in Portland with the 41st Military Intelligence Brigade in December. They're getting ready to go to Korea to deploy there, and sure enough, someone came up and said, yeah, I attended BYU and took some class at Kennedy Center. I'm like, every single time. So it's good to see that they're out there, the alumni are out there, and it's really, I really enjoy working with and being able to speak to you today from the vantage point of this institution. So, as I mentioned, this is a bit of a repetition, but not really, because a couple things happened recently that just kind of make this continually relevant. And first off, of course, is this 3rd nuclear test, right? 2 days ago, evidence of not an unnatural earthquake from the test center. It looks like they've tested another nuclear weapon, the North Koreans, or nuclear device, detonated another nuclear device underground. And the second aspect of this, the second condition was that in December, a new president was elected in the Republic of Korea, and Park Park Geun-hye was elected, and she happens to be the daughter of Park Chung-hee, who was the third president of Korea. So thinking of those two things, I thought about this just invites comparison, where we look at Korea through the sort of framework of two families, the Kims and the Parks. And there's lots of ways I've discovered in the last 30 years, or I'm much older than that, but I probably wasn't taking history seriously the first 20. There's many ways of looking at history. There's many different frameworks. Facts are facts, yes, but how those facts relate in context to the rest and to other facts and other things can just make us think about things a little bit differently. And one of the things I value about this institution and my job in particular is I get to go out and look at things in the world and not challenge conventional wisdom necessarily or the standard line on things, but look at them from a different perspective, which sometimes does in fact add, detract, or change what I consider the story. So we have Park Chung-hee over here at the top. He was and I'm going to talk about him, and then this is his daughter, who is now elected president-elect in Korea. She'll be taking over quite quickly. And then we have the three leaders of North Korea, the Democratic Republic, the DPR, sorry, Kim Il-sung. Oh man, that's my phone. That's terrible. Hey, it's a church number. And his son, and his grandson. So what I want to do first is just go into this and just kind of give a bit of a background as I turn my phone off, because that's really not good form. First off, Kim Il-sung. Installed in 1948. I mean, there's a tremendous myth surrounding this guy, a lot of myth making, and it's been sort of like from the beginning, from the very beginning. But he was installed as the leader of North Korea in 1948 by the Soviets. He fought in the war against the Japanese in World War II on that side. He was effectively held the post of prime minister from 1948 to 1972. In 1950, he invaded South Korea. And then in the 1960s, he did lots of things, but I'm going to refer back to these points, so I want to bring them up. In the 1960s, he sort of promotes this idea of juche, this sort of self-determination, independent state, which is going to have, I think, tremendous implications in the future. In the 60s, he also he oversees an escalation of violence centered on the DMZ, which the U.S. Army actually called the Second Korean War. And we don't even think about the Second Korean War from 1966 to 1969, but the intensity and the number of attacks on the DMZ and around that area were so much so that, and that in fact is a book written out of Fort Leavenworth from the Army Center for Lessons Learned and a few other co-sponsored by a couple of other Army institutions that talk about the Second Korean War. I don't think we really think about it too much because we were knee-deep in Vietnam at that time, and we had other issues going on, but there was a lot of action. Did you have a question?
Did they not even call it a war? The first one they called it the conflict?
That's probably true, yes. That's probably true. I mean, and there are, we can say conflict. I mean, it's even like they're still technically at war. We have an armistice, but we don't have a, peace agreement. And so there's lots of, the devil's in the details when it comes to the relationship between the two Koreas. But then in 1972, he proclaims a new constitution, becomes the president of North Korea. And then, of course, he dies in 1994, and his son, Kim Jong-il, becomes the new president. At the same time, well, not the same time. Now, Park Chung-hee, he starts in 1961 by taking over in a coup and seizing power in South Korea. He then elected the third president of the Republic of Korea in 1963, and there's been evidence that was partially in response to pressure from the Kennedy administration. So, it's again, that's kind of one of those things. That pressure was there. How much did it impact? How much did it influence? In 1965, he normalizes relations with Japan. Okay, so what? Well, Japan was an enemy of Korea and China and these places not so long ago. And what this does is it establishes economic relations, and it also helps with Japan. And it also sort of gives the North Koreans, and we'll talk about this later, this idea that they're starting to be ringed by enemies, U.S., South Korea, and Japan. So sort of this alliance. So there's things going on there. In 1967, he barely wins this 1963 election, by the way. But by 1967, he is reelected president. And the Constitution, as set in place at the time, was that they would serve 2 terms. Well, in 72, maybe prior to that, he decided he wanted to serve more than 2 terms. So he basically declares martial law, suspends the Constitution, declares himself president for life. Now, there were a couple assassination attempts on him. He survives them until 1979 at a dinner table when he's shot dead by the chief of his own security. One of the more famous assassination attempts prior to that, they end up killing his wife, and he continues his speech as his wife is being taken away, that speech he was given. But what I thought was really kind of interesting to look at is the two sort of conditions, economy and security, through the framework of these two leaders, and then their offspring. So in 1961, if you look at the income, and there's a million statistics you can put up here to show this, but I mean, basically, the South Korea economic state wasn't any better than the North. In fact, the North previous to this had the stronger economic base by far. It had all the industry. The South was more agrarian, had the agriculture. The North had all the residue from Japanese industrialization of North Korea as well, or the northern part of Korea. So GDP in current dollars, so these numbers match up, they're adjusted, is 2.357 billion US. And basically under Park Chung-hee, it's a very strong centralized state where they have a concept of what they call guided capitalism, which means the government, will be the state will be the engine of economic development. So there's strong central planning. There's government intervention in the market. There's industrial policy. The banks are nationalized. Lots of things happen, and they start to pull away in things like light industry, and we'll talk a little bit about that. At the same time, and this is what's so nice about this Park Chung-hee comparison, in 1961, the recent North Korean 5-year plan had just ended, and it was, from what information we have, successful, if not very successful. But they start on what they call their 7-year plan in 1961, and by 1972, things are really starting to go different directions. I mean, South Korea, based on this guided capitalism and other factors as well, becomes very robust. Its GDP starts to really heavily increase, and in 73, they actually pushed to heavy industries. And I took a this is Hyundai Heavy Industries in Ulsan, just above Busan in the southeastern part of South Korea, and they make, at any given time, 99 super tankers or big cargo ships are under construction. You're not allowed to take photographs there. It was a fantastic tour, probably one of the most interesting industrial marvels I've ever seen. But they've sort of like used this, they take these little bays here, and they have a way of, when they dry dock these ships and they're building these ships or working on them, they can then close them off and seal the bay, drain the water, or raise the water to get the ships in and out. And the thing is, these ships are huge. In fact, most ports in the United States aren't even equipped to handle these new types of super ships that are being built by the South Koreans and a few others. So, I mean, it's just a tremendous industry. You also have things like the steel mill, POSCO. You probably heard of that, that really becomes, and you have, of course, Hyundai Heavy Industries, as we mentioned. But the other thing that happens during this time is, in the 1960s, obviously they're very close to the United States, and they start sending, at our request, troops to fight with us in the Vietnam War. And this is a real boon for the Koreans, because the money comes under UN, and it's substantial, and the troops make a lot less, so the money comes to the South Korean government. So in other words, the paycheck they get from sending these troops to fight in Vietnam is actually quite large, and it's good direct investment. And so, in fact, you see this today. This is not an unusual model. If you look at the governments of like the Scandinavian countries, they're almost always under blue helmets in UN service all around the world. They have, and you can say, designed their armies to do UN service, because they make a lot of money. They make a lot of money for those. Greece, Turkey, they love having their troops on UN missions, because the UN rate to send troops to wherever they go in these war-torn missions is quite substantial. The money goes back into the national coffers, and then the soldiers are paid at a soldier wage. So it can be a huge revenue source for these countries, and this was huge at the time here in Korea. The other thing was, I mentioned, in 1965, they normalized relations with the Japanese. And this had a huge economic impact as well, because you had another source of direct investment in Korea. So at the same time, and the funny thing is, obviously going back into North Korea, trying to look at numbers, it's really hard to get accuracy out of North Korea, but you can say that basically their centralized planning sort of falls off the rails. And what I would liken it to is someone who lives paycheck, or a home that lives paycheck to paycheck, and then they have an illness and they go bankrupt, or they go under, they lose their home. There's no backstop. There's no, they spend most of their money building up the army, and for other reasons, and we'll talk about that. But by 1979, of course, Park Chung-hee is killed. The GDP is starting to really, really move. And the North Koreans are still sort of spending their money on arms, but one other thing, as I mentioned, they established this sort of doctrine of juche, this sort of self-determination and in fact, there's a book out, The Cleanest Race. Has anyone read this book about North Korea? It's one of my favorite books on North Korea. It's a little long in book form. It feels like it'd be a great paper. So it kind of regurgitates information, but this idea of how the North Koreans see themselves, it's really, I think, a valuable read. I mean, again, it's in a way, it's all guesswork by experts, I get it, but I mean, it's a really interesting insight as to how the North Koreans see themselves. You'll see how juche plays into this.
What's it called?
The Cleanest Race. So I'm going to show you just a clip from our movie on economics to sort of highlight things we've talked about.
After the end of the Korean War, South Korea was really struggling economically. It was South Korea that was considered to be the economic basket case, and it was only through beginning to industrialize and pursue export-led growth that they began to grow. And by most economists' accounts, it wasn't until the late 70s, early 80s that South Korea finally overtook North Korea in terms of per capita GNP.
The story of South Korea's economic success began humbly. Small companies run by ordinary Koreans like Mr. Lee.
When I first went to Korea in 1965, I met a friend, Mr. Chun, who at that time was working in a tailor shop. And tailor shops were the hot business in those days. It was one of the things that people could do, labor intensive. They'd measure you and fit you and cut the cloth. You had a tailor-made suit for very little money. When I returned to Korea in 1973, he was supervising a wig factory. Wigs don't sound like a major industry, but this was huge in Korea because it was a great way to capitalize on a natural resource Koreans had, good Korean hair. It doesn't sound like a major step in the economic development, but the wig industry was a huge step forward for Korea in terms of capitalization, in terms of learning to export and learning how the international market worked.
If you look at South Korea, you see with far fewer resources than the North, you see the extraordinary, stunning economic growth of the South, and you realize it's the same people with even better economic resource base in terms of natural resources and other sorts of things, and it's just an utter disaster.
세상에서 제일 좋은 우리 인민, 만난 시련을 이겨내며 당을 충직하게 받들어온 우리 인민이 다시는 허리띠를 토이지 않게 하며 사회주의 부귀영화를 마음껏 누리게 하자는 것이.
North Korean state television delivers a tightly controlled message, displaying only the purported successes of the regime. This is a stark contrast to the stories of deprivation and oppression from defectors like Mr. Lee.
I lived for about 10 years in Wonsan, Gangwon Province, until Kim Il-sung died and chaos broke out due to lack of food. There was no more food supply. Humans, like animals, must eat to survive.
If you look at the last decade, the last decade and a half, by most estimates, 1, if not 2 million North Koreans have died by famine. And no one else in the region died during that period of time of famine. So there's no other reason than the nature of the regime. So that's not to say that we should invade North Korea right now, that we ought to try to destabilize it and precipitously pursue unification now. But that said, that whenever we weigh these issues, that we need to be very cognizant that it is not a value-free equation. There are costs here, and they're very real costs in terms of the North Korean people.
I felt bad. We are the same people and we share the same blood. But on one side, there are so many airplanes taking off every minute and so many cars bumper to bumper on the highway, while on the other side, there is barely a car and many unpaved roads. The reality was the difference between heaven and earth.
Heaven and earth. The dramatic disparity between the two Koreas is so great that one of the primary concerns of South Korea is how to stem the tide of North Korean refugees they expect to spill over the border should there be an abrupt unification.
Early on, a lot of researchers tried to kind of figure out what level of standard of living would you had to have in North Korea where North Koreans wouldn't feel a desire to as mass floods of refugees go into South Korea. And to do that, say back in 2000, the assumption was that would have cost something about $4 trillion.
How do you take two remarkably disparate economies, keep people in place, and improve the one without everybody getting in there, on their bicycles and riding south?
So that's just a clip from the film that kind of highlights sort of the economic progression. But again, you don't have to be an expert to know. I mean, there's plenty of stories, there's plenty of statistics, and plenty of defector accounts of how bad it really is in North Korea. And again, remember that the South started with these light industries. And one of the things that was revealing to me was this whole wig industry thing. And as I heard about it first in Korea in 2009 from a professor, and it was interesting that what an industry that actually became. And to me, that just sounds like a hobby. But it became a major industry at the time, and again, what they considered the light industries. At the same time, we have a series of security provocations, and they're interconnected to the economic situation, but there's a number of them, and I just highlight some of them. Again, remember that Park Chung-hee comes to power in 1961 in a coup, normalizes relations with Japan, which makes the North starting to feel ringed in, among other things. And he also sends ROK troops to Vietnam in substantial numbers, generating an income, but also it's a militaristic move. It looks military. It looks like it's there to strengthen the military. And there's a number of local provocations which we'll talk about, but there's also other things that, and for instance, we go to North Korea, and I'll talk about local provocations, but I want to look at the nuke side of this a little bit. In 1958, we moved the atomic cannon to Korea, right there. And in violation of the agreement that was already established between the two countries. Now, we felt it was to redress the balance of power in the region. And so we moved, I think it's 8 atomic cannons, I don't remember. And they weren't there for very long, but they had the power to do that, to launch these nuclear weapons. So what they do is the North Koreans, in response to that, they started building sort of nuclear shelters and thinking this whole thing through from this, from that perspective. They also seek a mutual defense treaty with the USSR and the People's Republic of China, which doesn't really go as well as they want. But they do another thing too. They move their forces right forward deployed on the DMZ. So if you think of the map of Korea right on the DMZ, a large number of the North Korean forces move right down on that border. So therefore, if you're going to nuke my forces, you're going to have these fallout issues and all kinds of nuke issues in Seoul, because you're literally talking like 20 miles away. So it's kind of like, it's something like the Chechens, they're really good at tactics. Whenever they fight the Russians, you would never move away, you move close in. You get within the mortar range, you get within the circle. When we invaded Iraq, the US forces in Iraq, we had on these maps what we called the 3 rings, and basically it was within the Scud range. When we were just crossing the border out of Kuwait, we feared Scud attack or long-range missile attack. The closer we got to Baghdad, we didn't fear that attack because we're within the ring, and the same for the mortar. So it's the same strategy here. Move closer to your enemy. The U.S. puts atomic cannons on the border. We're going to nuke, Pyongyang or whatever. Well, they just move their forces right down the DMZ. So if you're going to nuke us, you're going to basically suffer this, going to suffer a consequence as well. It's not a terrible strategy. They also look at the lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis and feel, it looks like from the documents that are unclassified after the fall of the Soviet Union, there's sort of this belief that the Soviet Union isn't a reliable partner, that they kind of side with, they strike a deal with Kennedy. This does not fit well with the North Korean leadership, so they don't see them as that reliable, so they really go out looking for their own nuclear program. They They apply to the USSR. They appeal to the USSR to help them start a nuclear weapons program, and they're turned down. And again, the declassified documents from the USSR suggest that they're like, no way we're going to give these guys the keys to the nuclear. They're going to give it to the Chinese. They say they're going to give it to the Chinese and other regimes that the Soviets had beefs with as well, even within the socialist part of the world. But they do say they will help with a peaceful nuclear energy program. And eventually there are two, I think they're graphite reactors built in North Korea, and they produce a lot of nuclear waste, a lot of fissile material. And so the U.S. actually in negotiations decide that we will help the North Koreans replace these two graphite reactors with light water reactors, which produce far less fuels. But that never goes anywhere. And so now today, because we have the test just 2 days ago, we've had the North Koreans have had 3 nuclear detonations, 2006, 2009, and 2013. Coincidentally, myself and Eric Heyer, Professor Heyer, does anybody know Professor Heyer here? He does Chinese politics. We were on the Tumen River border on the day of the test, and we thought it was an earthquake, and so did everybody else, because everybody came out going, an earthquake here on the China-Korea border. And then we go back to the hotel that night, and they said, they tested a nuclear weapon. And so that's what it was. It was the aftershocks from this nuclear test. And of course, my friends, like, oh, you're going to get radiation. I'm like, well, no, the test is underground, but I mean, you could feel the shock. But, and of course, there's been multiple rocket launches, 2 just since the new president, Kim Jong-un, has come into power. 1 that failed, and 1 that did launch. I would say it's moderately successful. They got the satellite into orbit, but apparently it's on a degrading path, and I don't even know if it's still up there.
I was curious, how big is the yield on these? We wait till the end to get the mic.
Okay, yeah, we'll get the mic. But I'll answer your question real quick. I don't know what the yield on these nuclear weapons are. I mean, they've developed a whole series of these artillery rounds, and the yield changed, but I don't know exactly what they were. Good question. This incident here, this old surveillance plane, I think it's called EC-131. The North Koreans, as far as provocations go, were going to the local provocations. They shot one of these down and killed, and I think it's 1969, killed the whole crew died, 31. So the whole platform of U.S. Military specialists up there monitoring the region there, and they shot one of those down. But there's a number of them, and again, remember from 66 to 69, you have this such a rise in aggressive actions by the North that we call it the Second Korean War. That's been called Second Korean War. One of the more interesting events, if we look at local, there's 2 I highlight. One, because we got the chance to spend a day with Kim Shin-jo. Excuse me. Kim Shin-jo was a North Korean commando, and he was part of a 31-man team who, in their tracksuits, that was their cover, they somehow got through the DMZ, killed a number. There's his weapons. There's part of his weapons, a grenade, and a submachine gun, and a pistol. And they were going to the Blue House, which is the Korean White House, and they were going to kill Park Chung-hee. He's the only survivor of that raid. Everybody else was killed. About 60 South Korean police and military people were killed as well during that night. And in fact, if you listen to Mark Peterson, he was on his mission there, Professor Peterson. Anybody work with Professor Peterson here at BYU? Ask him about this story, because he hears the gunfire apparently from his house, so they go up on the roof and they're trying to see what's going on. I was like, you got to come in the house, the North Koreans are invading. But they capture him, and he said, we asked him, because a couple of the other commandos apparently committed suicide, and he had a cyanide tablet to commit suicide if he's caught. He just said, you know what, in the last minute I just decided I wanted to live. And he's since served some time, was interrogated, became completely converted to the South Korean way of life. I mean, one part of the rehabilitation or interrogation process was that they would just put him in a car and drive him around Seoul. And he said, for the first time, that all the stuff he thought was the truth as per what he was taught in the North was just completely wrong. That the South was this great place, that people had food, and if you worked hard, you could get ahead, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There was no political repression. The Americans weren't pulling the South Korean puppet strings. He goes, all these things. And he actually we asked him about the Americans, and he said, well, I found them to be honorable. He said, whenever I was tired, they stopped the interrogation. They came back the next day, and he goes, I just fell in love with the Americans from that point, which I thought was, an interesting contrast considering the use of enhanced interrogation techniques that we're debating now with films like Zero Dark 30 and just what's happened since 9/11. His interrogation apparently was way different. Just drive around the car, stop and get food when you're hungry, and take a nap when you're tired. But he became a famous minister. And he's very well respected and very famous in South Korea. just because, again, because of who he was and what he did. But and the other one I want to talk about, which is really interesting, is this the axe murders in 1976. Just to give you a flavor, this is a tree stump right here, and this is the Bridge of No Return. And there's some U.S. soldiers. This is shot from an observation point, and they were trying to see down to this area here, but this poplar tree, you know, in the summer, the leaves are big, and so it blocked the view, so you don't have any line of sight. And this is a big security issue in the DMZ where there's incursions all the time. So they went out to try to trim the tree and to chop it, and these North Korean soldiers came and they beat and hacked 2 U.S. soldiers to death with axes, which is called the axe murder. So on August 21, we launched Operation Paul Bunyan. Funny name, but apropos, I guess. And we actually call a carrier in. A carrier is off the coast. 800 soldiers. We have B-52s. That's a B-52, just in case you don't know, strategic bomber. This is actually photographs of these guys lining up as we basically cut the top of the tree down so that we can do the line of sight, because we didn't know if we were going to go to war over this tree, but we were prepared. So we staged an aircraft carrier off the coast. We had F-111 fighters. That was the fighter at the time, one of the fighters in the air. We had B-52s in the air. And we had artillery at all the, pinned against, and we were going to cut down this tree, and we did. I mean, when you think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it could have global implications. It could have led to nuclear war, and so it's not as dramatic as that. But when you think about these incursions and the rate of violence, there's been hundreds and hundreds, and Wikipedia is a good source to look at just basically how many events or direct action events or violent actions there's been around the DMZ and involving North Korean forces, and it's quite remarkable. I'm going to show a couple things about the security issue.
Mr. Lee's cross-border humanitarian operation, decried by North Korea and tolerated by the South, faces a sizable, almost impenetrable physical roadblock.
The southern boundary fence line that you notice running around here runs the defendable territory of the DMZ. It was originally intended to be 2 kilometers south, 2 kilometers north. Due to the fact that we can't support some of the area as to defend the Republic of Korea, they built a fence line along the defendable area.
The DMZ, the demilitarized zone, is an oxymoron. It's not demilitarized. It's the most heavily militarized place on the planet these days. It's a 2.5-mile strip that goes across the whole peninsula, cutting right across its waist, separating North Korea from South Korea.
Officially dividing the two Koreas on the 38th parallel since the Armistice Agreement was signed in the summer of 1953, the DMZ, or Demilitarized Zone, has been a bloody barrier between two nations still technically at war. After 60 years of tension, security still remains high with the constant threat of North Korean provocation.
I think the North-South relationship has been unilateral in the past. The South Korean people have worked very hard for over 60 years, beginning with labor-intensive industries to the current era of computing. At the same time, North Korea has continuously provoked us.
The list of North Korean provocations toward South Korea is long and growing. Since 1953, North Korea has violated the Armistice Agreement over 200 times. In recent years, the North has tested nuclear devices, long-range missiles, launched artillery attacks against South Korean islands, and most notably sunk the South Korean naval vessel, the Cheonan.
필승 야간 전원 투입 16명 참가 준비 끝. 필승
South Korea will not begin a war, but if North Korea begins a war, then there will be war. Also, we cannot overlook these local provocations anymore. We have had so many of them in the past.
North Koreans have this wonderful pattern of basically doing something quite terrible, and then there's a negotiation and they exact some price to promise not to do the terrible thing again. There's not a lot of evidence that conciliation has worked much. There's not a lot of evidence that, that a hard line has worked very much. And I think it's also fair to say that if you've reached your hand out and tried and it kind of gets either bitten or slapped every time, why continue with that policy? At least try something else.
The secret to understanding what's going on in North Korea is to understand that whatever they're doing, it's for domestic consumption. They don't really care that much about their relations with South Korea or with North United States. Their primary concern is maintaining their control and their hold on society.
Recently, the two sides are hostile. I told the South Korean government, do not provoke the North. The North Koreans are a very proud people. Even if they are beaten to death, they will never say it's painful. They don't apologize. Their history is a series of battles.
Well, I'm going to do one more clip just back to back.
The recent passing of Kim Jong-il and the succession of his son, Kim Jong-un, has ushered in a new era of North Korean saber rattling.
Two of the biggest obstacles to reunification right now are North Korean arms developments in two ways. One is launching missiles, and the second is developing a nuclear bomb. And of course, they've done both.
When you step back and look at broader regional and global issues and you start asking questions about denuclearization, that's where the problem becomes, more difficult. We have this problem that North Korea now has tested a nuclear weapon and they've declared themselves a nuclear power. Well, how do you engage North Korea without recognizing them as a nuclear power?
For the North, this is a huge step forward. This is validation that the socialist system is working, that they have scientists and technologists that are joining the advanced countries of the world that can launch a satellite and can develop a nuclear bomb. For a country that sees itself as surrounded by enemies on all sides, being picked on, being isolated, this is tremendous benefit for them domestically. And it's a huge barrier to unification.
동지들, 오늘 우리는 새로운 주체 100년대가 시작되는 역사의 분수령에 서 있음 혁명을 배운 우리가
The recent missile launch and threats to test nuclear weapons are suspected to be the result of the new leader out to prove himself and further consolidate power.
Imagine the situation that Kim Jong-un is in. A young man raised for this job, pruned for this job, and yet surrounded by some men that are old enough to be his grandfather, in uniform with stars on their epaulette, and he is their commander.
It was almost impossible to imagine a scenario while Kim Jong-il was alive where North Korea would begin to reform or open, or even that you'd have real instability at that level of power. But now with the transition, there's an opportunity for change.
As long as they have nuclear weapons, they will not want unification. We predict that they may provoke us with many other attacks. There has to be an abolition of nuclear weapons and a change in their strategic idea.
We've got a rogue regime that has the capacity for developing nuclear weapons and selling fissionable material. While it may not use it itself, selling it to people who are less reticent to use it.
If we were to, in the effort of trying to solve the Korean Peninsula problem, ignore that, right? Ignore everything they've done, we would de facto recognize them as a nuclear power. And the question then becomes, if a country that is poor, starving, backwards, a pariah regime that abuses human rights, smuggles drugs, counterfeits currencies, has never met a weapons system that it wasn't willing to export to the worst people in the world, if that kind of country can be recognized as a nuclear power and as a negotiating counterpart as a nuclear power, who can't?
So, there's a lot of things to think about when we talk about provocations. Of course, you have the nuclear issue, you have these sort of conventional, or they refer to them a lot as local provocations. And one of the things I think is worth noting again is that the ties between the financial situation, the economics, and the security is there from the very beginning. In fact, if you look at some of these things, I mean, obviously we had the former Marine Corps commandant, so you can imagine he's fairly conservative, pretty hawkish, as you could probably tell from his speech too. But there are those who obviously feel that every move the South Koreans make, and the U.S. As well, is countered by a North Korean move. And so they sunk the Chonan, that's true. But then the South Koreans, I think a few months right before that, shelled one of their ships and killed a number of North Korean. Now, again, it goes back to the armistice line. There is this line out even through the sea, which side is South Koreans, which South Korea's, which side is North Korea's, who's violating that. And in those cases, it seems almost every single time it is the North. But these issues are still real issues. So it leads us to today. We have, the daughter of Park Chung-hee, and we have the grandson of Kim Il-sung, and they will now, these families will square off again. And the question is, what's going to happen, and are they? It seems now, at least in the research that we've gone through for this film that we've made, and that these countries are farther apart than they ever were. We haven't even talked about social factors, the younger generation, issues with language. The language that evolved in South Korea has not evolved in North Korea. Economics, of course. I mean, the Republic of Korea ranks 15th in the world in GDP, and now North Korea is, just hovering at the bottom. We have a tremendous humanitarian disaster going on right now, and my personal feeling is, and this is very, very complicated, because I know if you go to the far right, like libertarian stance, for instance, we don't believe, though that group doesn't believe in any foreign intervention, and some people say, well, the left doesn't agree with that, believe in that too. And the Republicans here in America might be more hawkish, obviously hawkish and to the right, and let's project our power, global U.S., global century, that kind of thing. But the fact is, if we truly understood the magnitude, and if we saw it every single day on the news, and you really, really saw the images of what's going on in North Korea and how these people are starving to death, like by the millions, my feeling is it would force the international community to act. It just would, because on a humanitarian level, on a personal level, our soul to their soul, our spirit to their spirit, you can't let people suffer that way. You cannot. It's like a moral obligation. However, as Gordon Flake mentions, and as the world knows, the cost of taking this situation and fixing it, if you can even say fix it, is going to be astronomical. I mean, 2 years ago, the president of Lee Myung-bak, the current or outgoing president of South Korea, floated the idea of a reunification tax. I think it was 2%. And what he wanted to do was to start building up a piggy bank, so when unification took place, or when it takes place, they kind of have these funds in the bank, because this is trillions and trillions of dollars, and it didn't go over well at all. It just died. There's also been talk about, what do you do to stop 20 million North Koreans if they do choose to get on their bicycles, as Michael Young mentioned, and try to ride across the South? Do you deploy South Korean troops against North Korean refugees? Or do you let Seoul become flooded with 5 or 6 or 7 million North Korean starving refugees? What do you do? This is a tremendous, so really what you have is a sort of status quo. And in the end, what we found is, because I don't know if these two individuals are going to bring anything closer together. I kind of doubt it. We already see that, we've had 2 missile tests and a nuclear test since Kim Jong-un has come to power. The economy certainly isn't getting any better. But it appears that, you're going to probably have the same sort of status quo. In fact, the Japanese, and I think as Gordon Flake mentioned in there, everybody talks and wants reunification, but not right now, because no one really wants to deal with the cost. So in talk, we deal with it, but you don't really do anything to make it happen. You just reinforce the status quo. And that's the story of the Koreas right now. Anyway, that's my opinion. But I know we're getting close to 1 o'clock. I think I'll wrap right here. Again, it's kind of silly, but the Pox and the Kims, I thought it was kind of good. I think it's going to be business as usual in the future. I don't see any sort of break, but you just never know. You just never know. Thank you very much for coming out and listening to me ramble on about Korea. Any questions or comments? And I may not know all the answer, but I can farm it out to Corey or someone else who does.
Bring a mic, or just tell us your name and what you're studying as well.
Sky Herrick, International Relations. Why do you think there's such a huge difference between the command market economy, or however it's practiced in South Korea, and the development of the North Korean, which was in essence still a command economy?
What I think there's a difference now. I mean,
there was when they first started.
Well, I think, it's hard to say. I mean, one of the problems, this is the biggest problem with analyzing North Korea. I mean, during the Cold War, I've mentioned this before, we had Kremlinologists, right? People that were always trying to, our analysts, what the heck is going on in the Kremlin? And we had PSYOPs, these plans that basically said, here's how you defeat the Soviet Union. But we had to make value adjustments, value assessments, like, we believe they value this, and we change our PSYOP every 5 years. We don't know what it's really hard to get accurate information out of North Korea. We had the testimony of lots of defectors. There's about 20,000 North Korean defectors now live in the Republic of South Korea. It's estimated that up to 200,000, but it's probably less, have actually gotten out from the north, and they're floating around in China or Mongolia or wherever they can, till they can maybe get to South Korea. But based on those kind of things, we do know that the North Koreans really put a lot of focus into a large army. That was the other factor of putting the atomic cannons in. They built their army up to 700,000 at that time, and the police force, I think to 200,000. That was their response to this atomic cannon. So and I don't know what they're thinking. You're going to nuke us. We lose 20,000 in that minute, but that's okay because we have another 60,000 that are going to go around the flanks and still get you. I don't know. But, and you can see how the Korean War itself was fought with large numbers of bodies flowing into the breach. Also, there's a number of other things that happened, like the oil shock of 1974, these fallouts and the competition between the Chinese and the Russians. So you have a North Korea that's a sort of I call it a junior socialist state in the sense that it's smaller, it doesn't have the resources that Russia or China has. It's dependent on a client relationship, and those two are feuding after '59 and the Sino-Soviet split. So you have lots of things, and it goes back to this idea that they just never. Again, I hate to boil it down to like a family finance meeting, but you don't have anything safe for a rainy day. When the oil shock of '74 comes, or the Soviets and the Chinese start feuding and you're caught in the middle, and you develop Juche doctrine, which is so they became self-isolated. And so they didn't have any they have no oil. They're self-isolated, which is funny. If you look at a lot of the provocations, a lot of it is to drive currency. They need currency. The defector that we met, he used to smuggle drugs out of North Korea and super notes, counterfeit U.S. $100 bills. And he did that for the Air Force. There's an Air Force Academy, and he did it for one of the other government institutions because they have a quota of hard currency they have to raise. And that's been documented, or at least through testimonies of other defectors as well. They just don't have any money at this point. But I think a lot of things contributed to it, and it's a long, steady decline. And now I don't believe they have the means to put it back together unless they do really, they're going to have to reform everything. It's interesting, you read a lot of I had to read a lot of economic theory as I did this program, and one of the things I found is strong centralized state governments or state economies over the government intervention over the economic sector can actually do really well to a point, and then you need to let that go and go into a free market, and that's kind of like the ideal model. And in a way, maybe that's why things worked under Park Chung-hee, because it was so strong. Again, this is debatable. There's people in South Korea, analysts, who just think he was a train wreck from day one, and those who feel like he's, on the other side, saved the Korean economy. I don't know. We know where that goes, but that's a long-winded non-answer, wasn't it? So.
Jonah Malika, International Relations. I'm just wondering, with North Korea's relationship with China, how dependent do you think they are? And with China getting a lot more harder on North Korea, especially with this nuclear test, they've been criticizing them, and they're actually calling their ambassador and being like, what the heck? So where do you think China's relationship is going to develop with North Korea, and how do you think that's going to progress? And what kind of outcomes can you see coming from that?
Well, it's interesting. There's a consensus among everybody we interviewed and talked to about this program that China's just not really thrilled with North Korea. They don't feel like it ever goes well. It's like a thorn in their side. But again, they're one of those countries that would have, it would impact them directly, a quick reunification based on a collapse of the North Korean government. So they kind of want the status quo. So again, the way Japan, the US, and Korea perpetuate the status quo, I think you still see China perpetuating the status quo in the North Korean regime. They would like to slap them across the head, I think, once in a while when they do things that the Chinese would rather they didn't, but I don't think they want to see the alternative, like a North Korean collapse, because then what? the North Koreans aren't going to absorb South Korea. They'd be the other way around. And so that puts a whole new security calculus on the peninsula for the Chinese. So as much as I think they're annoyed with them, I think they'll reinforce the status quo as well. But this is an interesting thing too, because South Korea is China's largest regional trade partner. At the same time they support the North, there's complete open relations between South Korea and China. In fact, it's interesting because you can take a plane from Seoul, fly right over North Korea on Korean Air, and land in the Korean Autonomous Prefecture, which is the capital is Yeonji, where it's like 1.2 million Yanbian Koreans live there. They're Chinese citizens, but they're Koreans. They speak Korean. And you can then take the tour bus, one of a million, it seems, every day, that shuttles Korean tourists up to Heaven Lake, right there, which is part on North Korea and part in China, which is sacred territory for the Koreans. So, I mean, the relationship between South Korea and China is fully functioning as well. It's really, China's just got this North Korean thing they're working with, and they have full relations with the South.
You said early on that when you are looking for a story, you look for some fact that would change the picture. I take it that in this particular instance, you chose to look at the two families, the Parks and the Kims. What drew your attention to really looking at the relationships that these families have within the country?
One, the fact that it even was back, because we know that the North Korean regime has been passed on, right? It's, father, son, grandson. I just think it's an interesting coincidence, simply that you have another Pak in the Blue House, but also Pak, in my opinion, is the most controversial of all the South Korean presidents. I mean, he comes to power in a coup. He presides over a period of tremendous economic growth. He basically digs South Korea out of just out of poverty. He builds up the military. He expands light industry, heavy industry. So to me, and he's in there for a long time, and he dies a violent death. So. And I look at the parallels of 1972 when they put a new constitution here, and he suspends the constitution. So now they're both in 1972, for at least that time, until he dies in 79, presidents for life. So it just seemed like an apropos comparison to me.
I'm Katie May. I'm studying Middle Eastern Studies and Arabic. So recently, South Korea's come into a lot of soft power through their pop culture, like Psy, that we've recently seen.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the youth of North Korea and South Korea earlier. Could you talk a little bit more about the relationship there? Are they compassionate, or do they hate each other, or what's going on?
Interesting. Oh, that's a great question. And we cover this in the longer version of the film. And I know we're going to have a screening in a few weeks, I'm sure, here at least. Corey's shaking his head. So yeah, sometime we're having a screening. But we cover that because it's interesting. The youth culture in South Korea, they don't have any connection to the youth in North Korea, first off. North Korea is still very, very, very isolated. You have a couple million elites, and they live in usually Pyongyang, and they're in the immediate vicinity. They're connected to the government, and they have access to an intranet system and things like that, so they can communicate. They have cell phones, and you have 20 million people starving to death. Basically, what it appears is what's going on in North Korea. The South Korean youth are more and more distant from North Korea. Over and over and over, we heard this again, that it doesn't mean anything to them. It means something to their parents, because their parents either suffered through the war or through the hardships of being completely poverty-stricken, like in the late 50s and early 60s. And so many of them actually still knew a family member in North Korea. But this younger generation, they don't know their, surviving family members in North Korea. They have no experience of the war except on TV and books and the museum and stuff. And so they're more and more separate from that. And so they overwhelmingly, as a bloc, are not pro-unification at this point. They just don't have those ties. So, and at the same time, they're becoming more Western, more global. I mean, we talk about the Hanyu, this sort of Korean wave that swept through Asia, and now it's gone global with, Gangnam Style and Psy. That was a big breakout. But I mean, Korean youth, they're sort of dominating pop culture in Asia during this time. But yeah, their connection to the North is just non-existent. Which is interesting because, they have mandatory military service in South Korea. And so we talked to DJ Soulscape and VJ Kwan and a number of these pop guys, and went to their studios for a while. And it was really fun for us. And they all came out of the Army. They all spent their time in the Army. They still, even though they had that brush with the security and the issues of security, North Korea was as distant to them as They said, we don't relate to these, I don't know what these people are like. And what they found is it cuts both ways. I mean, the North Korean refugees come, and they really found that one language has evolved, one has not. So North Koreans, they're not easy to understand. They have strong accents, so people can always pick them out. Oh, you're North Korean refugees. So they don't like, so there's a world of differences right now that's separating them. And the younger generation just doesn't have that connection anymore, which is sad. Mr. Lee, you kept hearing Mr. Lee. He's our North Korean defector in the film, and he has 2 kids, and he's just, worried that his kids, it won't mean anything to them, North Korea, because they came when they were really little. They're going to grow up in South Korea. They look like, they're just like every other kid in South Korea. They like their iPad, and they go to school, and they whatever, and they play, and they listen to music and stuff. And North Korea is just like this vague notion, even though that's where mom and dad came from. It's a good question. With, again, implications that probably reinforce the status quo of separation. Well, thank you very much for coming out, and I'm still here for a few minutes if anyone wants to talk offline. So thank you again for attending.